My mill banned me from hosting Thanksgiving, insisting I didn't have what it takes to handle real family traditions. When her perfect dinner turned into a full-blown disaster, she blamed me for not helping and is now demanding I host the day after to save face. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. It wasn't just the food or the decorations. It was the sense of togetherness, the shared laughs and the stories that made the day feel so special. This year I was finally getting the chance to host. My husband and I had just moved into our first home and I had been dreaming about this moment for months. I spent weeks planning the menu, scrolling through recipes online and even testing a few dishes to make sure everything would be perfect. I wanted a mix of traditional staples like turkey and stuffing with a few personal touches like my famous pumpkin cheesecake and a roasted vegetable medley that I knew my husband loved. It was going to be a Thanksgiving to remember, or at least that was the plan. When I mentioned my plans to host at a family gathering, I expected some excitement or maybe even a few suggestions. Instead, my mother-in-law's reaction was immediate and cutting. She laughed, not in a kind, amused way, but in a dismissive, almost mocking tone. She said she admired my enthusiasm, but hosting Thanksgiving wasn't something you could just decide to do. It required experience, skill, and a deep understanding of family traditions that, according to her, I simply didn't have. She added that Thanksgiving was a sacred tradition in their family and was earned. At first I tried to argue my case. I explained that I'd already started preparing and that I wanted to create new traditions for my husband and me as we started our own family, but she wasn't having it. She said it was too important to risk a novice mistake, ruining the day, and declared that she would be hosting. The rest of the family remained awkwardly silent except for a few nods of agreement from her loyal allies. Like my sister-in-law, my husband Matt tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that maybe we could co-host or split the responsibilities, but my mother-in-law shut that down quickly, saying there couldn't be two captains of the same ship. I left that conversation feeling defeated and humiliated. It wasn't just that she had taken the opportunity away from me. It was the way she had dismissed me so completely, as though I wasn't capable of handling something as simple as hosting a family meal. Over the next few weeks, the preparations for mother-in-law's Thanksgiving went into overdrive. She sent out detailed emails with assigned seating arrangements, dress codes, and a strict itinerary for the day. Every now and then, she would throw in a passive-aggressive comment about how much work it was to plan an event of this magnitude and how she hoped everyone appreciated her efforts. I tried to focus on the positives. At least I wouldn't have the stress of cooking for a large group and I could sit back and enjoy the holiday. But the closer we got to Thanksgiving, the more her jabs started to get under my skin. She would call to ask for Matt's opinion on the wine pairing, making a point to exclude me from the conversation, or she'd casually mention how difficult it was to find a turkey that met her high standards, implying that I wouldn't have known where to start. Matt noticed my frustration and tried to comfort me, but his attempts often felt more like appeasement than genuine support. He said I shouldn't take it personally, that his mom was just set in her ways and didn't mean anything by it. He assured me that once she saw how capable I was, she'd come around, but his words felt hollow, especially since he wasn't willing to stand up to her and defend me. As the big day approached, I decided to take a step back. If she wanted to handle everything, I would let her. I told myself I wouldn't lift a finger unless she asked for help, and even then I would tread carefully. The day before Thanksgiving, mother-in-law called to remind me of the dress code, cocktail attire, because apparently this wasn't just a family gathering, it was a formal event. She also reminded me to arrive early to help with the setup, even though she had made it clear I wasn't part of the planning. I bit my tongue and agreed, not wanting to give her any more ammunition. That night, as I laid out my dress and mentally prepared for the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of resentment bubbling under the surface. I had wanted so badly to create something special for my family, to start a new chapter in our lives, and instead I was being treated like a guest in my own holiday. Thanksgiving morning, Matt and I arrived at mother-in-law's house an hour before the rest of the family. The kitchen was a whirlwind of activity, with pots bubbling on the stove, dishes piling up in the sink, and my mother-in-law barking orders at anyone who came within earshot. She gave me a once-over and said she hoped I was ready to pitch in, adding that she had serious doubts about my kitchen skills but was willing to give me a chance. Her tone was so condescending that I almost walked right out then and there. Instead, I smiled tightly and asked where she needed me. She handed me a pile of vegetables to peel and chop and then hovered over me the entire time, critiquing my technique, making snide comments about how long it was taking, and by the time the rest of the family arrived, I was ready to scream. As everyone settled in and the appetizers were served, I tried to focus on enjoying the day, but mother-in-law wasn't done yet. She made a point to announce how much effort had gone into the meal, listing every dish she had prepared and how long it had taken her. She said she hoped everyone appreciated her sacrifices, especially since she had taken on the responsibility to ensure everything was perfect. I glanced at Matt, hoping he would say something to deflect her attention, but he was too busy chatting with his dad to notice. I felt completely alone, trapped in a situation where I couldn't win no matter what I did. I sat there smiling through clenched teeth and nodding politely at her backhanded compliments. I was comforting myself by saying that one day or another I was going to prove her wrong, but it didn't take long for the show to go down. The scene at mother-in-law's house was poised on the edge of collapse, though no one dared to say it out loud. Mother-in-law was clinging to her facade of control, but even her rigid schedule couldn't save her from the inevitable. The first sign of trouble came with the appetizers. Mother-in-law had boasted earlier about her famous cheese platter, claiming it was a family favorite, but as guests began nibbling, murmur spread and some of the cheeses were past their prime. Uncle Rick made a face after taking a bite, muttering under his breath about the pungency being a little too authentic. Mother-in-law, noticing his reaction, quickly explained that it was supposed to be bold and European. Still, she pressed forward. The dining room had been decorated to perfection with matching linens and personalized name cards, as if she were hosting a dinner party for royalty. Mother-in-law beamed as everyone took their seats, clearly expecting admiration for her efforts. Matt's dad began carving the turkey under mother-in-law's watchful eye. The bird was undercooked. In her rush to perfect the side dishes, mother-in-law had left the turkey in the oven for too short a time. The center was raw and it wasn't salvageable. Mother-in-law's face turned crimson as whispers filled the room. Aunt Linda, ever the practical one, suggested slicing the outer layers and microwaving them to make do. Mother-in-law looked horrified at the suggestion, snapping that microwave turkey was beneath their family traditions. Meanwhile, the sides weren't faring much better. The sweet potato casserole had been sitting too long and was now lukewarm with a rubbery marshmallow topping. The green beans were overcooked, their vibrant green reduced to a dull, unappetizing shade. The stuffing was still too salty despite mother-in-law's earlier adjustments, and the gravy was lumpy. As the family awkwardly picked at their plates, the conversation became strained. Someone mentioned last year's Thanksgiving hosted by Matt's cousin Claire and how everything had gone so smoothly. Mother-in-law shot Claire a look so sharp it could cut glass, quickly changing the subject to the wine selection which she had chosen herself. The breaking point came when mother-in-law's piece de resistance, a towering centerpiece of candles and flowers, tipped over mid-dinner. It wasn't clear who had bumped the table, but the crash sent wax spilling onto the tablecloth and petals scattering across the plates. Gasps erupted around the table as mother-in-law jumped to her feet, frantically trying to salvage the situation. In the chaos, a glass of red wine toppled onto mother-in-law's pristine white carpet. She froze, staring at the spreading stain as if it were a personal affront. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to help or stay out of her way. It was at that moment that mother-in-law turned her attention to me. Her eyes burned with accusation as she demanded to know why I hadn't stepped in to help earlier. She said it was my fault the evening had gone so badly because I had just sat there doing nothing instead of acting like a proper daughter-in-law. I was stunned. The blame was so misplaced, so absurd that for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Matt tried to intervene, saying that mother-in-law was just stressed and didn't mean it, but his words only seemed to fuel her anger. She began listing all the ways I had failed her, from not offering to take over the turkey to not warning her about the unstable centerpiece. I could feel the heat rising in my face as she continued her tirade, her voice growing louder with each word. She accused me of sabotaging her, of deliberately sitting back and letting her fail so I could prove some sort of point. I glanced around the room hoping for someone to step in, but the other guests looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Aunt Linda cleared her throat and suggested we all take a break and enjoy dessert in the living room, but mother-in-law wasn't finished. She turned to Matt, demanding he make me apologize. Matt looked torn, caught between his mother's fury and my incredulous expression. He mumbled something about everyone needing to calm down, but it was too little too late. Mother-in-law was already storming out of the room, leaving behind a trail of tension and silence. After she left, the rest of the family began quietly gathering their things. No one wanted to stick around for dessert after what had just unfolded. Uncle Rick muttered something about catching the game at home while Aunt Linda gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder before making her exit. Matt and I stayed behind to help clean up, though mother-in-law was nowhere to be found. As we loaded the dishwasher, Matt finally broke the silence, saying he didn't understand why his mom had lashed out like that. He said she must have been under a lot of pressure and didn't mean what she said. I bit my tongue, not wanting to argue, but inside I was seething. This wasn't just about stress. Mother-in-law had made it clear from the beginning that she didn't think I was good enough, and now that her own dinner had fallen apart, she was trying to deflect the blame onto me. When we finally left, the drive home was silent. Matt seemed lost in thought and I was too angry to speak. I replayed the evening in my head, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently, but deep down I knew the answer. No matter what I had done, mother-in-law would have found a way to criticize me. Update 1. The next day I was still fuming when my phone buzzed with a text from mother-in-law. She wanted to know if I could come over to discuss a family matter. I showed the message to Matt, who shrugged and said I should go, adding that it might be her way of apologizing. I wasn't so sure. When I arrived at her house, she greeted me with a tight smile and offered me tea, which I declined. She sat across from me at the dining room table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She began by saying she had been thinking a lot about what happened and wanted to make things right. For a brief moment I thought she might actually apologize, but then she dropped the bombshell. She said she had decided the family needed a second Thanksgiving dinner to erase the memory of the first one, and of course she wanted me to host. I stared at her stunned. She said it was only fair since I hadn't stepped in to help the first time and insisted it would be a chance for me to prove I could handle the responsibility. She even offered to send me her recipes and come over early to guide me through the process. Her tone was patronizing, as if she were doing me a favor and it was all I could do to keep my composure. I told her I would think about it and left as quickly as I could, my mind racing with a mix of anger and disbelief. When I got home I told Matt what had happened. He looked surprised but said he thought it might be a good opportunity to smooth things over. I couldn't believe he was siding with her again, but I didn't have the energy to argue. That night as I lay in bed I made a decision. If I was going to host Thanksgiving, it would be on my terms, not hers, and if mother-in-law thought she could control the narrative, she was in for a rude awakening. Update 2. I decided to do the Thanksgiving dinner too. The morning of my Thanksgiving dinner, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. If I was going to do this, it had to be my way. The stress and spectacle of mother-in-law's attempt had drained the joy from the holiday and I was determined to reclaim it, at least for myself. My vision wasn't about perfection. It was about warmth, simplicity and letting everyone feel like they belonged. I spent the week planning and prepping, but my focus wasn't on elaborate dishes or over-the-top decor. Instead, I leaned into what I loved: comfort food, cozy settings and family being at ease. The first change I made was the seating arrangement. I ditched the long formal table in favor of something more intimate. I pulled together every mismatched chair in the house and borrowed a couple from the neighbors. The table was set with simple white plates and linen napkins accented by small candies and a few candles, not a single towering centerpiece in sight. For the menu, I skipped the complicated recipes mother-in-law had insisted I use. Instead, I made the dishes I knew well, the ones that brought me joy to cook. It was a roast turkey seasoned simply with butter and herbs alongside a honey-glazed ham as an alternative. The sides were classic, but straightforward: creamy mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic and almonds, and homemade stuffing that didn't involve a single boxed mix. For dessert, I baked an apple crisp and a pumpkin pie the day before, avoiding the frantic last-minute rush I had seen mother-in-law put herself through. Matt helped where he could, running to the store for last-minute items and keeping me company in the kitchen. I noticed he seemed more relaxed this time, perhaps because I wasn't barking orders or stressing over every detail. When the first guests arrived, I could sense a shift in the atmosphere right away. Instead of being greeted with rigid instructions and a schedule, they walked into a home filled with the scent of roasting turkey and soft music playing in the background. I greeted each person warmly, encouraging them to grab a drink from the little bar cart I had set up in the living room. Aunt Linda arrived first, carrying her famous spinach dip. She took one look around and smiled, saying the house already felt more inviting than last week's debacle. Uncle Rick wasn't far behind, balancing a bottle of wine in each hand. He joked about needing both after what he called the Thanksgiving apocalypse. As more relatives trickled in, the living room filled with laughter and conversation. People mingled freely, sipping on cider and nibbling on appetizers I had laid out. A simple cheese board, veggie sticks and a bowl of my favorite spiced nuts. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. Mother-in-law arrived with Matt's dad about 30 minutes later. I could tell from the moment she stepped inside that she was on edge. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the casual setup and the relaxed vibe. She didn't say much, just handed me a covered dish and mumbled something about it being her contribution. I thanked her and placed the dish on the buffet table, resisting the urge to peek inside. From her expression I could tell she was already comparing my efforts to hers, looking for any detail she could criticize. When it was time to eat, I called everyone to the table without much fanfare. Mother-in-law hovered near the kitchen, offering unsolicited advice about carrying the turkey and arranging the dishes. I nodded politely but ignored most of her suggestions, focusing instead on making sure everyone had what they needed. The meal itself was everything I had hoped for. People passed dishes around, piling their plates high and complimenting the flavors. Aunt Linda declared the mashed potatoes the best she'd ever had. And even Uncle Rick, who was notoriously picky, said the turkey was cooked to perfection. The conversation flowed easily, with stories and jokes filling the room. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of the family rather than an outsider looking in. Even Matt seemed more at ease, laughing along with his cousins and stealing bites of pie when he thought no one was looking. Mother-in-law, however, was a different story. She sat stiffly at the end of the table, poking at her food and occasionally interjecting with comments about how she would have done things differently. She mentioned her failed centerpiece, calling it a lesson in over-ambition, but it was clear she wasn't over it. At one point she remarked that my green beans were a bit too rustic stick and suggested I use her recipe next time. Aunt Linda jumped in saying she loved the simplicity and thought it was refreshing not to have everything drowned in cream and cheese. Mother-in-law's smile was tight as she took another bite, clearly biting her tongue. After dinner, I didn't insist on a strict cleanup schedule or delicate tasks. Instead, I encouraged everyone to grab dessert and settle back into the living room. Some people stayed at the table chatting while others gathered around the fireplace to share old stories with drinks. Matt's younger cousin, Emily, came up to me at one point and said she hoped I would host again next year. She said the whole evening felt more like what Thanksgiving was supposed to be, about family and connection, not stress and showmanship. By the end of the night, even the skeptics seemed won over. Aunt Linda gave me a big hug before leaving, saying she hadn't enjoyed a Thanksgiving this much in years. Uncle Rick promised to bring an even better wine next time, saying my cooking deserved it. Mother-in-law was one of the last to leave. She lingered near the door, her expression unreadable as she thanked me for hosting. She said it was nice to see the family come together and then added that she hoped I hadn't been too overwhelmed. I could tell she wanted me to say it had been difficult to give her some validation for her earlier claims that I couldn't handle it. Instead, I just smiled and said it had been a pleasure, watching as her jaw tightened slightly. When the door closed behind her, I let out a deep breath. Matt came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist and kissed the top of my head. He said he was proud of me and admitted he hadn't realized how much of a difference the right atmosphere could make. As we finished cleaning up, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. I had done what I set out to do: create a Thanksgiving that wasn't about proving a point or living up to someone else's expectations. It was about family, connection and showing everyone, including myself, that I was capable in my own way. Update 3. The morning after dinner, I woke up with a sense of calm and clarity that I hadn't felt in a long time. Hosting the dinner had been a success, and not just because the food turned out great or the guests had a good time. For the first time, I felt like I had proven something to myself, that I could create a warm, welcoming space without bending to anyone's impossible expectations. But, as I had anticipated, it wasn't over. Mother-in-law was never one to let things go quietly. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message from her. She had typed out a lengthy text, but the opening line already told me where this was going. She felt the need to express how I had undermined her role as the matriarch of the family and that my hosting was an attempt to take over. I stared at the screen for a moment before handing the phone to Matt. He skimmed the message, his face twisting into a grimace. He said it was just her usual way of deflecting and not to let it bother me. I told him that I wasn't bothered, I was just done. Mother-in-law's accusations didn't hold any weight for me anymore. What had started as an insecurity fueled by her constant belittling had turned into resolve. I told Matt I wasn't going to engage with her anymore unless it was absolutely necessary. If she wanted to cling to her narrative, that was her choice. Matt nodded, but looked uneasy. He said he would talk to her, but I stopped him. I reminded him that while I appreciated his support, his mom was his responsibility to handle, not mine. As the day went on, messages kept coming, each one more dramatic than the last. She claimed I had disrespected her legacy, ruined family traditions, and driven a wedge between her and her son. At one point, she even accused me of turning Matt against her, a comment that made me laugh out loud. By evening, she switched tactics. Instead of messages to me, she started calling Matt. I could hear snippets of their conversation from the other room, her voice rising and falling, Matt responding in calm but firm tones. When he hung up, he looked drained. He said she wanted to clear the air by inviting us over for coffee the next day. I told him I wasn't interested. He asked if I was sure, saying that maybe it would help smooth things over. I said that while I understood his perspective, I wasn't willing to sit through another one of her veiled insults and backhanded compliments. I told him he was welcome to go, but I was staying out of it. Matt went without me, and when he returned he looked even more exhausted than when he left. He said mother-in-law had spent most of the time rehashing the same arguments, insisting I had overstepped and made her look bad. She wanted an apology, not just from me but from Matt too for letting it happen. Matt said he told her that there was nothing to apologize for and that the family had genuinely enjoyed the dinner. He said he reminded her that the first Thanksgiving was her idea and that I had only stepped in when she asked me to. She didn't take it well. Over the next few days, mother-in-law's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would send long emotional messages one day, I see one word, text the next. She tried to rally other family members to her side, spinning the story to make herself the victim, but to my surprise, most of the family wasn't buying it. Aunt Linda, who had been one of her staunchest supporters in the past, called me to say she thought I had handled the situation with grace. She said she appreciated the effort I had put into the dinner and that she felt it was time for mother-in-law to let it go. Even Uncle Rick, who usually avoided family drama like the plague, reached out to tell me he thought I had done a great job and that he was looking forward to my next Thanksgiving dinner. The support from the family meant a lot, but it was Matt's reaction that mattered most. I saw a shift in him. He started standing up for me more, pushing back against his mom's attempts to control and manipulate. One evening, after another particularly heated phone call with mother-in-law, he sat down next to me on the couch and sighed. He said he was tired of always being in the middle trying to please everyone. He admitted that he had spent years ignoring her behavior because it was easier than confronting it. I told him that I understood, but I also reminded him that his mom's issues weren't mine to fix. I said that while I was willing to support him, I wasn't going to keep putting myself in situations where I felt disrespected or devalued. Matt agreed. Thanksgiving became a turning point, not just in my relationship with mother-in-law, but in how I saw myself. I realized that I didn't need her approval or validation to feel confident in my role in the family. I also learned the importance of setting boundaries even when it's uncomfortable or causes conflict, especially since it has only been a year since we got married. Update 4. I received an unexpected call from Uncle Rick. When I saw his name flash on my phone, I braced myself for one of his usual jokes. He greeted me with his usual energy, asking if I had a minute. I smiled, knowing this call would probably be a welcome break from the tense family atmosphere. When I agreed, he immediately jumped into what seemed like a serious request. Rick explained that he needed me to do him a favor, something real serious. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued, and asked him to go on. His voice dropped into a mock-serious whisper as if he were sharing some secret. He wanted me to host a little get-together, but here was the catch. He wanted it to be a secret gathering, no mother-in-law allowed. I was taken aback, blinking in surprise at the request. A secret gathering sounded like the perfect escape from the usual family drama. He confirmed it, adding that it would be a post-New Year's celebration and, by the way, his birthday was the day after New Year's, so this would also double as a birthday party for him. I felt a spark of excitement. A birthday dinner that was all about fun without worrying about impressing anyone. That sounded perfect. I asked if he was seriously asking me to host his birthday dinner, but keep it under wraps, and Rick let out a loud laugh, assuring me that it would be more than just a celebration of his birthday. It would be about having a good time and letting go. Rick's tone shifted as he explained the details. He wanted a small casual gathering with everyone bringing their favorite dishes, no fancy seating arrangements, no stress over food and cooking, just food people loved and enjoyed together. He promised he would handle the drinks and said everyone could chip in with sides. I could bring my famous dessert and he'd take care of the main course. The whole idea was to make it all about enjoying each other's company, not following a rigid plan or stressing over perfection. I laughed, already feeling the pressure lift off me. I told Rick that I'd bring my pies and even promised to come up with a few fun games for after dinner. Rick sounded like he was on cloud nine when I agreed, saying that this was exactly the kind of celebration he'd wanted, something fun, relaxed, and without anyone breathing down their necks about traditions or standards. The more he spoke, the better it sounded. He would make sure the real family knew about it and that everything was kept quiet. I assured him I was in, already looking forward to it. When I hung up the phone, I was grinning. I couldn't wait for this to happen. I was genuinely excited for this.